My family was always in a financial rut, especially after my mother passed and my father moved to New Jersey with me and my sister. If you're familiar, New Jersey property prices aren't as bad as New York's, but their taxes are crazy. Bad as it is, me and my father always took work, whether it was running a good truck, cleaning some guy's house, or working on the road. Our most common job was truck driving. He got a somewhat stable job from a family friend who owned a trucking company down near Newark. It likely isn't there anymore. He had to relocate after flooding. We would haul shipments of food and metals, deliver truck parts, or even just do something as simple as take it for repairs when the mechanics weren't available. Making $200 for just driving a couple of Mack trucks, it was pretty good work for someone my age. Not to mention my father, who was half crippled, who couldn't even lift himself off the floor if he were to fall. All of this would change, however. We had a job to deliver food supplies to Fort Dix, pretty standard. We ended up delivering more than required, and my father, being the sneak that he was, decided to keep a chest of meat for ourselves. It was about mid-August, near the end of the summer rush for people to come to the shore. This meant a large amount of drunken young folks, families, and even the occasional nudist would flock down the highways like a group of birds, swarming the beaches and boardwalks. This meant an extra buildup of traffic and thus more accidents. We listened to the traffic report whenever we made a haul, short or long. It provided us with weather, what routes to avoid, and so on. This is how we knew our usual route was piled up after a drunk driver got behind the wheels of an SUV, plowing into another car, and the domino effect just followed. Luckily, the pileup was pretty small. But for us at the time, it was more than a small nuisance, needing to plan a detour with the sun setting, already behind schedule. To make it short, after cursing out the tourists on the radio, we decided to simply take the more secluded, rural back roads of the surrounding barrens. This was mostly bear swamp, a large nature reserve, and hunting area during the deer season. It also had some bear and even bald eagle preservation, but I can assure you, what we saw and heard on that back road, it was no eagle. The detour put us off schedule for about an extra hour and a half, sending us right through the swampy roads, flooded with mud and dirt. Not to mention the pitch-black darkness and having to drive slowly due to deer or coyote running across the road in the pitch-black darkness. I remember joking with my father about going for a swim in the swamp because our AC had broken at the time. "Hey Dad, how's about a dip with those gators?" He said something along the lines of wishing you could feed Saul, the family friend, to the gators for not getting the dang air fixed. The night swamp was oddly mystical looking as I watched it from the open windows. A bright star and the few lightning bugs you could see in the distance. It was a really good scene. Despite what most say of Jersey, it isn't all smokestacks and highway. Something was off, however. Middle of summer, driving past a swamp. Normally, you would hear the calls of frogs or even an owl in the pines. Granted, our truck engine would be spooking most of the animals, but all the same, this amount of noiselessness was out of place. As I enjoyed the view, my body flung forward against the dashboard as my father slammed on the brakes. He hit the horn at the same time. "What the hell?" I practically shouted at him, my teen voice still cracking. How stupid I must have sounded. "Deer on the road. Big sucker, too. Should tell your granddad to come out here next winter." He was plain and simple about it, something I hadn't inherited from him. Pulling myself into my seat, I strained my eyes to see past the darkness, to which I did see a tuft of hair disappearing from our headlights, flicking like that of a cat's tail. Oddly, it was dark from what I could see. The fur was blackish ginger instead of the usual brown or white a deer would have. Its length was off as well. If I could guess, I'd say it was a good 5 inches long. About another 20 minutes later, we had made it deeper into the wooded area, passing the farmland and meeting the old cabins and hillbilly hotels that scattered the woods like buckshot. It wasn't like a suburban cul-de-sac in the middle of the woods. These houses were spaced out a good 15 minutes from each other, if not more. As we were making our way down the long, winding path, praying not to get shot by some crazed redneck, who we may have awakened from a deep sleep. It hit us. And literally, a loud snapping noise like a metallic bang as something landed on top of the truck. First, we imagined it was just a tree limb hitting the top of the truck. Being quite tall, it had knocked many branches off before. But it began moving, like rocks hitting the metal. All you heard was snap, clank, snap, clank, as whatever it was too tall to move under the branches, hitting the roof and trailer. At this point, my dad stopped, intending to exit the cabin and see the commotion for himself. Then came the most horrific thing I've ever seen in my life. Even now, as I share this. Grizzled, dark hair, gingerly black like it was burnt, long round snout like a donkey, but with bulldog-like teeth, fangs peeking from its lips. Its claws were just that, long finger-like appendages that ended in sharp, almost metallic-looking talons that scratched across our windshield. Hanging from each arm was a long flap of skin connected to its barrel-shaped chest as it slithered across our hood. If I had to guess a length and width, I'd say it was about as big as a professional basketball player, probably around 200 or so pounds. Its eyes weren't glowing like most would say, but in the light of our cabin, they reflected like that of a cat's eyes. It had next to no ears, just a flat head, except for two curled growths on its head, like filed-down antlers, dull and short. As it stared into our truck, its nose flared and exhaled deeply, its breath fogging up the glass before it slithered back up, the clanking noises returning as it climbed over the truck itself, hitting the roof of the trailer, its tail coming up and lashing about. The tail was long and reptilian, dark gray with a tuft of mangy hair on its tip, thin and large at the same time. It lashed out sideways, swooping off the hood before smashing into the side of the truck. I've been in plenty of car-on-car accidents, and I can tell you honestly that when you're in a vehicle that is rocking back and forth on two wheels, it's not pretty. As we landed back down on our left side, the tail swooped out again, with just as much force, shattering my father's window. Never before have I seen a 50-year-old man nearly soil himself. The creature must have reached the back of the trailer. I started feeling as if we were tipping backwards before a loud screech ripped through the air. Honestly, if anyone has ever heard a bat squeak, imagine it amplified and drawn out. Just as I was about to break down in a panic, a loud ripping noise followed, a series of loud clanks as its claws dug through the back of the truck. This was met by the truck jerking violently, back and forth, the sound of heavy breathing in our ears as it climbed in the trailer, and a lurch as it climbed out. Finally, the sounds of branches snapping and a quickly fading flap, 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 as wings flew off into the night. We sat there in silence. We were scared to death. Our truck just sat there as we stared at the dimly lit dirt path before us, partially unsure of what happened, half expecting the thing to return, and half not believing what actually happened. After 10 minutes of sitting in cold sweat, we started the engine and drove to the yard another 2 hours. And the entire way there, we were silent. We told Saul about the dragon, but he wrote it off quickly as backwood freaks trying to rob us for food. We did discover a whole crate was busted open at the lock, the door as well hanging on a hinge that was discovered by a cop who had pulled us over halfway there. Growing up in Jersey, you always hear stories of the devil, the old legend of the Lees family, or the tale of the King of Spain, the joke about the man and the kangaroo. But most only believe them as stories, nothing more. But that night, looking into the snorting nostrils and hearing that blood-curdling scream, I was convinced that the devil is no myth. Perhaps they're right. New Jersey really is a portal to hell. I didn't experience this myself, but my friend Bree did. This took her a lot of courage to speak of this demon attack again. But I'm telling you, this is all real. I was babysitting a 13-year-old boy named Mike. I know, that's a boy who can look after himself. But his parents asked me to babysit him because he tended to run off and get into trouble while they were gone. They left around 8 that night. Me and Mike watched TV for about an hour. Then we heard a tapping sound. It was coming from above us. I walked around the living room, looking up at the ceiling, trying to pinpoint where the tapping was coming from. And when I got close enough to where the tapping was from, it stopped, and it didn't start up again after that. The next night I came back over to babysit Mike again, or hang with him, he would say. Hours passed by when the tapping sound came back. I ignored it, but me being an easily annoyed person, I stood up and searched for the tapping. That night though, Mike seemed worried about the tapping. When I stood under the ceiling where the tapping was coming from, it stopped. Mike yelled, making me jump. I looked over at the living room from the kitchen. The TV was turned off and the lamp lights were flickering. I walked back into the living room, confused and frightened a little. And once I came back into the living room, everything went back to normal. The lights stopped flickering and the TV came back on. What did you do? I asked Mike, a little angry. He just looked at me, his eyes filled with fear. What's wrong? I asked, sounding worried. But he didn't respond and just kept looking at me. Then, a door from the hallway slammed hard. I sat down on the couch next to Mike, and we both stared at his hallway. The door kept slamming. Every slam seemed to get louder. The TV suddenly turned off, but came back on as a white screen. We looked at the TV scared, and it made sparking sounds, and then the TV started to glitch black. A mumbled voice was barely audible from the TV. Mike covered his ears, crying now. The TV then blew. The shards of the screen flew by, and I lifted my arm to cover my eyes. I looked over at Mike, who had covered himself with the couch pillow. Me and Mike jumped off the couch and ran for the front door. The lights still flashing, some of them blew up too. We made it outside and onto the road. Mike ran to his neighbor's house. I stayed still on the road staring at the house. The house looked alive and crazy. I got this horrible feeling that something evil was looking at me. I turned toward the end of the street at the street lamp. A black figure was standing under it. I stared at it. The evil feeling coming from that black figure, and the thing didn't even have a shadow. Its head seemed to lean to the side, and that just made me feel sick. Bree, I heard Mike say, grabbing my shoulder. He turned me toward him, my sickening feeling fading. He was talking to me, but I wasn't listening. I just looked around him at the street lamp. The black figure was gone. After that, I never babysat for them again. Mike kept trying to make me come back, saying that they got rid of the evil spirit. He told me that a priest came into his house and cleaned it, so I finally gave in and agreed to hang out with him at his house. His parents were at work at the time, so I slowly stepped into his house, fear filling my entire body as I remembered what happened last time. It's okay, you're safe, Mike told me. He handed me a necklace with a cross on it. I hastily put the necklace over my head and let it dangle from my neck. I felt better knowing that I had protection. An hour later, it was still day. I was going to head home before it got dark, so I kept checking the windows. He asked me to grab his soccer ball from the attic as he set up the goal. I stopped when he asked me that, but my courage came back when I gripped my cross on my chest. I walked up the stairs to the attic. My steps were slow and they creaked every time I stepped on one. I walked into the attic, shivering a little now. It was cold, and the dark room didn't help with my fear. Not to mention the light in the attic was broken, and the only light was from the window. I tried to stay in the light, searching for the soccer ball, but I didn't find anything. That's when I heard a sound like fingers sliding on wet glass. I looked at the window and what I saw was terrifying. The letters were still being written as I read them. The sentence said, "Do you want to play?" I walked backwards to the stairs, scared to death. The boxes in the attic started rattling. The light of the attic flashed, and now the sentence from the window was scratched into the wall. Tears were already coming down my face. A board flew at me. The corner of the wood board smashed into my nose. I fell backwards onto the steps. My head smacked a couple of times on the steps, and I hit my back against the wall at the bottom of the stairs. My whole body ached. The pain was stinging my back and head. My vision faded a little, and I felt blood flowing out of my nose and onto my clothes. I looked back up to the top of the stairs, still crying, and that black figure was standing at the top. I screamed my lungs out as I stared at the black figure. I could now see its red and black eyes staring back at me. It had a sinister grin of sharp teeth. "You want to play with me?" The voice sounded like a child, but followed with a deep, dark laughter that echoed in my head. I was screaming even louder now, running down to the door. Mike opened it, and I crashed into him as I ran. "What's wrong?" he shouted at me, scared himself. "It's in there," I cried. And that's when I felt a wrinkly, bony, cold hand grab at my ankle. I screamed out again as something tried to pull me back inside. Mike pulled me back away from his house and onto the street. His neighbors were running over to us. I was scared to death, and when I looked back to his house and saw the thing staring at me still, I wanted to run away, but Mike kept his grip on me. After I calmed down, which was about an hour later, I told my parents what happened. Mike and his parents were listening at the time. They were all shocked. The only evidence I had was that my shoulder was dislocated from falling down the stairs, but I did have 3 long, deep scratches on my ankle. I never went back, ever. Mike and his family left that house. Our family left as well. I didn't want to be anywhere near that house.
This began when I was little. My mother's friend was a security guard, and one day she brought me a list of those codes they use to communicate different situations without making the public panic. And I invented a game where I would knock the different numbers on the wall and it would mean something to the imaginary monster in the wall of my bedroom. I played this with a friend of mine for some time. Then we went into a place my family called the secret bedroom, which is basically a room on the 2nd floor that was all the front house in length, connecting my parents' bedroom on one side to my brother's bedroom on the other side. The room was never finished and is extremely dirty with tons of dead insects and graffiti we did over the years, but it was our favorite playroom. So what we did is that we sat in the middle of the room and started playing again. Then one of us had the idea to knock nursery rhymes onto the wall to see if the monster would answer. And strangely, this time, he did. He would finish all the songs correctly, to the point we were convinced it was my youngest brother in his bedroom playing with us. But when we opened the door to his room, we saw he was simply playing video games. He got mad when he saw us enter his room. We also realized the spot we were knocking on wasn't even connected to his bedroom. It was right between the 2 rooms where there's nothing on the other side. If you go far enough, you would just reach a wall that was situated over the main staircase. And to actually reach it, you would need a really tall ladder, and to dare yourself to install it right in the middle of the stairs, so it was impossible someone was playing with us. But being the kid I was, I just forgot about it after a couple of days. Not so long after this, I was taking a shower when I heard someone knocking on the door. I yelled, "What is it?" But no one answered. I left the shower and opened the door to see who it was, thinking they didn't hear me. But no one was there. I could hear my parents in the living room downstairs and my brother playing video games in his room. I just shrugged and went back to my shower. Time passed. On one particular night, I really wasn't tired, but since it was bedtime, I was stuck inside my room for the night. I played different games in my bed when I had the idea to make a small tent by getting under the covers and extending my arm, forming this so-called tent. When I did, someone knocked, but right on the palm of my hand. I get a chill in my back and just waited, thinking I just imagined it, but it happens again. I could feel the knuckles on my palm and thinking I would catch my brother doing a prank on me. I quickly removed the blanket off of myself, but still, no one. The door was still closed and there was no sign of life. I had trouble falling asleep that night. The next event jumps all the way to the holidays, so long later that as a child I actually completely stopped worrying about it. I believe it was a Christmas morning. I had been woken up by knocking in the wall of my bedroom. The knocking clearly did the first verses of Jingle Bells, and thinking I was imagining it again, I jumped right out of my skin when I heard my father yell from the other side of the wall that I need to stop knocking on the walls because he needs some sleep. And my father is not the joking type. It clearly wasn't him. I talked to my mother later that day and said she heard it too, but she just didn't really care. The very last thing I ever had to do with the hand was when I was playing in the basement with my cousins and my youngest brother. We would play a game called The Whistler, which is pretty much hide and seek in the dark, but the point of the game is that the ones hiding need to scare the ones searching before the seeker scares you. My cousins and I were all hiding in the same big room, and I hid inside an old wardrobe on one side of the room, while they hid on the other side, so we could get him from both sides at the same time. When my brother began searching and entered the room, I was getting ready to strike when something grabbed my ankle. I screamed, and I was a bit mad I lost so easily, without even noticing my brother. But the truth is, when I went out of my hiding place, they were all staring at me with huge eyes. I told my cousins my brother got me, and my brother said, "No, I couldn't have. I was still at the door." My cousin, still on the other side of the room, just didn't speak a word, and we exchanged roles. This was the last time I had contact with the hand, and since then I have moved out of the house, so I doubt I will ever feel or hear it again anytime soon. Before I delve into telling you my tales, I must warn you that I don't mind if you believe me or not. These experiences are real, and they have shaped the person I am today. With that, let's begin. These experiences take place from when I was 7 to most recently, of November of 2015. We shall start at the beginning, the first apparition. As stated before, this happened when I was 8. I had just fallen asleep. One of those close your eyes, open them, and it's suddenly 7 in the morning kind of nights. However, I awakened around 4. The right side of my bed was pushed against the wall, so I turned my head and saw nothing but wall. I then turned the other way, and that's when I saw a figure that will haunt me until I am laid to rest. Its eyes were black, a black hole for a mouth. Its skin was greenish gray. I remember pulling the covers over my head and trying not to scream. I peeked out from the covers and saw it was unfolding and folding its arms, as well as opening and closing its mouth, almost like it was trying to say something, but no sound came out. I then remember blacking out, finally opening my eyes, only to find out that I had lost 4 hours, making it 8 in the morning. This was what sparked my experiences. My second experience wouldn't happen until I was 10. I was watching TV one Sunday before church. I suddenly had a feeling of intense dread and fear come over me, like eyes watching me. It got so bad that I hid behind the couch I was sitting on. I stayed like this until my mother dragged me out to go to church. Throughout the day, those feelings permeated my entire body. This lasted throughout the summer, each day the feelings getting stronger and stronger. Every minute I spent in my house, the greater the feeling of dread and of being watched. The first night I was feeling this way, I remember closing my eyes and seeing a white skull shape. The details are fuzzy as this happened many years ago. That feeling, though, of something going into me, and I remember feeling completely isolated and alone. I started crying and screaming for my parents. They came rushing in to find me in the fetal position, whimpering. Nothing happened again until around January of 2015, when the same feeling came back. At this time my family had moved, not out of the state, but just a few miles down the road from where we originally lived. It didn't come on as fast as when I was younger. This time it was a lot more subtle. I felt minor bursts of dread instead of feeling weeks of it, as well as easily shaken feelings of being watched. Now this is where it gets crazier. I started to hear a voice. It had the overtone of a child, but it had a deep gravelly undertone. It would say things like, "You are mine, by my power." After hearing that, I decided to seek a priest. I told him everything that was happening, and was convinced that a demon was terrorizing me. He told me how to, in his words, rebuke spirits. This worked for a time, and the activity died down for a few months. It started to pick up again when I got interested in Ouija boards. It was a week before Halloween that I got one, had started using it immediately. Each time I would use it, I got a feeling of what I can only say feels like something wanted to enter me. It wasn't on one specific place. I felt this feeling throughout my entire body. Each time I used it, the feeling gets stronger and stronger. It is now 3 months since this time, and since I used the Ouija board last. There has been no activity since, and at this point I'm just waiting until something else happens.
Hello, my name is Alyssa. I have a story for you. I am 17 years old, but my encounter with the paranormal happened when I was 16. My story takes place around May or June of 2016. It was moving day. I was helping my stepmother move. Since I had not seen her new house, I went with my uncle to go see it. While waiting for my family, my uncle began telling me that the oldest brother, Mondo, himself, and his on and off girlfriend had been visiting haunted places and playing with a Ouija board for the last 2 weeks, but kept returning to this farmhouse for the last 5 days straight. As my uncle told me about this farmhouse, my excitement grew and grew. I really like creepy things, especially anything that had to do with the paranormal. I then confessed I wanted to go visit this farmhouse as well. Turns out, they were going again that night, so they let me join them. We left the house around 11 or around midnight. The farmhouse is called Barrett Ranch House. It is located right off of Proctor Valley in San Diego, California. The miles of dirt road travels from Chula Vista to Jamul. Proctor Valley is notoriously haunted, and it has been for over a century. So the way I saw it was that we were driving on a haunted dirt road to a haunted farmhouse. However, our actions continue to reflect our idiotic behavior throughout the night. It didn't help that this took place during a full moon. According to Mondo, cults tended to worship at Proctor during a full moon. To make matters worse, by the time we were actually on Proctor Valley, it was witching hour. The whole time, Mondo was texting a girl who had went with them last time to the farm. He was asking her if she wanted to go. She said she was at the border at the moment, but would take an Uber ride to meet us there. When we finally arrived at the farmhouse, my uncle made sure to check with his headlights to make sure no one was there. As soon as we pulled up, I felt a sense of déjà vu. A few nights before, I had a dream that I was 5 and had went to a red school that was located next to a red house. Both buildings had looked exactly the same in my dream. After knowing it was empty, we drove back to a gas station to wait for the girl Mondo was talking to. We'll call her Tiff. After what seemed like forever, Tiff finally showed up. We repeated the process of making sure no one was inside. The coast was clear. After we got out, we all heard a bat. Mondo explained every time they heard the bat, something was going to happen. From the farmhouse, you could see Proctor. The whole area was covered in red clouds that had specks of gray and black. The farmhouse's clouds were white, with hints of blue and green from the full moon. This only added to the eerie feeling I felt. I also felt sick to my stomach. All of us except Tiff had a weapon, and slowly we made our way into the house. The door was missing. Windows that were covered up were now completely exposed. Random items such as photos or board games were scattered all across the floor. There was a shredded wall with a big hole on the left side when you first enter. There's a chimney to the right. After the main room, there's a little hallway. And at the end of that hallway, you can either go straight into another room, or you could go upstairs that led to the attic. So there's a total of 3 rooms in this house. The room next to the end of the hallway had all kinds of rubbish. There was even a sign that said not to vandalize the house. Apparently, one day the owner wanted to restore it to its former beauty. After we left that room, we headed towards the attic. This whole time I was gripping my knife so tightly that I could have cut myself with it if it wasn't in its sheath. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I have never been so scared in my life, and that bat wouldn't shut up. It was like a fire alarm system. It would stop for 2 seconds, but then would start up again. There wasn't much in the attic. It was small, probably about the size of a classroom, if not less. There were a couple of wrappers from the gas station that was across the street. This hinted that someone could possibly be living there or hanging out there at the moment. There was also a hollow space that was probably used for a closet, but it was empty. My uncle's on and off girlfriend, who we will call Kate, had told me that I looked sick. I reassured her I was fine, even though I really wasn't. We finally went downstairs to the main room. We went through the rubbish on the floor. My heartbeat was still beating pretty crazy, but within the next second, it dropped to the pit of my stomach. In 1 second we were chatting, the next we heard footsteps from the attic. We all turned to one another. The expressions on everyone's face told us that they had heard it too. Quickly, we huddled together. We debated on what to do. Like the coward I am, I wanted to go outside. I wanted to get away. Kate had said she had heard the bushes from outside shuffle. However, I was running on fear. That meant I didn't care. I hadn't heard it yet. I listened closely. Sure enough, there was something moving in the bushes outside. At the moment, I thought it was a rabbit, so I insisted on going out. Mondo and my uncle decided to stay and check out the attic. They wanted to take pictures and see if someone was up there, even though we were just there like 5 minutes ago. Kate, Tiff, and I all went outside. Mondo and my uncle didn't go straight to the attic like I thought they would. At first, they just stood in the main room. Mondo took lead into slowly going into the hallway. The girls and I stood outside more than 15 feet away, staring at the shuffling bushes. None of us moved, though. We wanted to wait until the guys had come out to investigate. My pounding heartbeat only sped up as I remembered the colts that were out that night. I thought there was a possibility someone or a group of them were in the bushes, ready to lure us out to our deaths or jump us. The bushes in the back were a couple of feet tall, but in front was a patch of small, thin, see-through bushes. They were almost like flowers. There were two right next to each other, so close they were touching. In spite of that, only one was moving. 2 large bushes and only one was moving. By the sound, it seemed like something was stepping on it. Kate had her eye on the bush that would move frequently. I kept my eye on Mondo and my uncle. They were about to enter the hallway, when all of a sudden, they ran out of the house as fast as they could. My panting brother commented that they heard a loud thump that was right next to him. Kate pointed to the bushes, saying how they were moving. At first they were still, but then they began to shuffle once more. With squinted eyes, my uncle made his way over there. Then it stopped. A few seconds later, the bush shuffled again. My uncle stuck a camera into its face, and it stopped again. My uncle backed away, and again it began to move. My uncle commented that it seemed to flatten, as if it was being stepped on, which is what I had thought as well. We all went over to the area and stuck our hands out. It was as cold as a dead body. You could immediately tell the difference of the temperature. My uncle wanted to see if anyone was there messing with us, so we walked towards the house that was next to it. And there was no one. Tiff yelped, explaining there was someone in the window. Kate shouted back that was impossible because the windows of the first house were covered with wood. They weren't. They were covered last time, she stood, mouth agape. We made our way back to the second house. My brother and uncle wanted to go back in, but I just wanted to leave. In the midst of our talking, I heard something scraping across the cement outside the house. That table just moved, Mondo gasped. I hadn't seen it move, but I heard it. It was a black stand that looked kind of like a table. No one else saw or heard it, but I immediately believed him, since I know I had heard it too. It looked heavy, so I doubt anyone could move it easily. After that, Mondo, Tiff, and my uncle went back into the house. Kate and I went down the little hill to our car. I heard those short, 2-foot-high bushes move. I literally jumped into the seat, not caring that I landed a little painfully on a purse. We had to wait probably 30 minutes before Mondo, my uncle, and Tiff returned to the car. We made our way back to Proctor Valley. They wanted to play the Ouija at Proctor. Now, my father is a devil worshiper, so I knew it was wrong too. Not to mention it was a full moon, and it was the witching hour. However, I considered playing. We settled in the middle of Proctor. We all sat in the car, Mondo asking if we were going to play or not. My uncle cut the engine. We were in complete silence. We all waited until someone got out of the car, but no one does. Mondo lights a cigarette. Apparently last time they played the Ouija board, there was a little girl and a little boy. My brother calls out the little girl's name. "Do you want to play with Kate, Sarah?" Mondo asked. Sarah was apparently the little girl from the Ouija board. Kate curses at him. You could tell she was starting to get scared. She then too asked the little boy if he wanted to play with Mondo. Did you hear that? We all froze. Kate sat in the passenger seat while Mondo sat behind her. They were the only two that had heard the noise. We sat in silence, still debating to play the Ouija board or not. We beat around the bush about playing it. Still, no one got out of the car. I closed my eyes, then I heard something break behind us. The closest way to explain the sound was as if a chip bag was opening. Mondo had asked if anyone heard that one. Everyone shook their heads except me. I nodded. At this point, Kate was pretty scared when the tree a couple of feet away from us also shuffled. My uncle took pictures around the leaves. Kate pushed herself closer to my uncle. "Look at the tree," she pointed at the camera. "Yeah, it looks like a blue orb." My uncle took more pictures. "Sarah, is that you? Do you want to play with Kate?" Mondo teased. "That's not funny, Mondo," Kate cursed. "They're right outside my window now," she yelped. My uncle looked through the photos with Kate. "They do look like orbs," my uncle repeated. Let's go. I want to go." There was a plea in her voice, and I wholeheartedly agree. We did leave since it was near the end of the witching hour. We didn't play the Ouija board, and I fell asleep after that. I never did get to see those pictures. I asked about them, but my uncle said he didn't know where they were, and that was the end of that. Later, I found out that the Barrett house had been a nursery.
When I lived in southeast Pennsylvania, I would often go on walks with my dog, Randy, through wooded trails near my home at night. I've always enjoyed the nighttime. It seems more peaceful, not to mention I loved painting and sketching. Every time I went on one of those walks, I'd come back refreshed and inspired. I did my best painting on these late nights. The trails we walked on used to be bustling four-wheeler trails that the neighbors used almost constantly. They had been avid hunters, fishers, those sort of folks. They were also extremely nice and didn't mind me using the trails as often as I wanted to. Sadly, though, the couple that owned the property had died a few months before this story took place. The man had died of a heart attack, and his wife passed away maybe 6 weeks after from what my mother said was old age. It was depressing, really. They were some of the nicest people I have ever met. At the start of the trail, you could see their 2-story home on top of a hill, overlooking the nearby lake. It was gorgeous. I wished I could live there. Now the place was dark, and it seemed hollow. That night, I stood staring at their house for a moment, thinking about life a little more than I was used to, before I took an impatient Randy into the woods. He was really excited. He usually was when he went on walks, but tonight he seemed more anxious. For the first time since he was a puppy, Randy was tugging at my leash as I tried to keep up. He was never that pushy. He seemed to have found the scent of something curious. Randy kept his nose to the ground and kept zero slack on the leash. It was hardly peaceful with the dog dragging me around. But I didn't want to reprimand him. He had never acted up like that before, so I let him keep going. Who knows, maybe he'd stumble on something interesting. Or gross, we all know how dogs are. I started to worry, though, the moment he stopped. He began to whimper. His ears fell flat as he looked straight ahead, eyes wide. I could see him sniff the air in between whimpers. To be honest, it kind of freaked me out. All of this was beyond unusual for him, and it was dark, in the middle of the woods. The creepy factor of it all was palpable. It was tempting to head back. Before I could even decide whether or not to keep going, Randy snapped backward and ran back on the trail so quickly that I lost my grip on the leash. He ran full speed toward home. And after a few moments, I was alone in the woods. The realization of that fact hit hard. It seemed to fall silent. The nocturnal insects chirped at a whisper now. too spooked to run, if that makes any sense. I turned back to walk home. I was honestly a little pissed at Randy for being such a wuss and abandoning me, but I was just so ready to be home. I needed some sleep anyway. I walked the slightly uphill trail as fast as I could, without going too fast that it made me feel like I was running from something. Then, I heard it. It was a screech, a howl, and a scream at the same time. Have you ever heard something so sudden and out of this world that it not only made you jump, but it sent chills throughout your whole body? Imagine that twice over, and that is how I felt the moment I heard it. I couldn't understand how something could sound so human and inhuman at the same time. What worried me even more was the fact that I couldn't place where it came from. I started to jog now. I have no earthly idea why I didn't just run. When I heard the call again, my heart seemed to jump into my throat. It was cold that night, but I was sweating. Finally, I pushed myself to run. That noise was so far beyond human, I was sure I'd be dead if I didn't run with everything I had. After a painful minute of running, I broke through the trail's opening, and it was out of the woods. I didn't bother to turn around. I was just glad that I was away from whatever I had heard. But the screaming came again. The sound had been coming from ahead of me, not behind me. I'd run toward the noise. How could I not have known it was coming from ahead of me? I clambered backward, terrified. I couldn't go back into those woods, but I couldn't go forward toward those noises. Flop, 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 flop. I heard footsteps. They were coming from directly ahead of me, maybe 30 or 40 feet away. But I couldn't see anything. There were trees shrouded in complete darkness, peppered sporadically throughout the clearing. It must have been hidden by the shadows. For several agonizing moments, there was silence. No screaming, no footsteps. Maybe it was my imagination. I was praying that that's what it was. To my horror, a face poked out of the darkness. It was just a goat. I almost laughed with relief. I was confused, but at least I wasn't horrified anymore. I remember thinking where the hell the goat had come from. We didn't own one, and neither had the neighbors. I picked myself up, eager to get home. I walked forward and to the left, where the trail went to the backyard of my home. I looked back. To this day, I regret looking back. What I thought was a goat was hovering at least 15 feet in the air. Wings somehow darker than the night flapped behind it. I had enough. I turned and broke into the fastest run I could muster. In seconds, I was opening the back door and locking the deadbolt. I stared out of the window. The center 80% of the door was made of glass. But I didn't see anything. I kept staring for the longest time, wondering what the hell I had just seen. There was nothing. Thank God, there was nothing. Eventually, I turned around toward the living room. My dog, Randy, was just sitting there on the couch, looking up at me like he had been waiting for me for a while. My parents must have let him in. I don't know what it was I saw that night. I've told quite a few people about my experience, but no one believes me. I doubt anyone ever will. And to be completely truthful with you, this isn't so much a story as it is a confession. I want an explanation. And every time I tell this tale, it makes me feel a little bit better. So thank you for listening.
Before I get you all started with my experience, I'll give you a little background on me. I spent most of my life hunting and in the outdoors, so I know the various sounds. I can tell the difference between a deer and a person walking. I also am pretty good at tracking and would track my friends while hunting, so the one thing that I never expected was to be tracked myself in the woods at night. This happened a year ago to the month, while out camping with my grandfather in New Jersey. I had just graduated school and was leaving for boot camp soon, so my grandfather wanted to go on one last trip before I was gone. The beginning of the trip was pretty smooth, lots of hiking and fishing. We went to the last place we were going to camp, and already, it was pretty eerie. There were almost no people here. We were about as far as you can get in. We had set up and already eaten, so I decided I might as well walk down to the wash house about a mile down from us. The park had signs up about bears, so I had my knife on me. This being New Jersey after all, we have strict gun laws. I got down there no problem. Only saw one person, and they were getting ready to head out. I take my shower and do my usual hygiene routine. By the time that's over, it's already pretty dark out. Almost 100 meters down the road, the atmosphere goes south fast. It went from bugs making noise to dead silence. Something I had never experienced in my time outdoors. It has never been that silent. You know that feeling, almost like a sixth sense, of knowing something isn't right? Well, that was going off in my head. I slowed down my steps to reduce the noise, and I listened. About 20 yards to my right, something was parallel to me, walking. My first thought was probably a bird hopping in the leaves, but every time I stopped, it would stop as well. Listening closely, I could hear it better, and I could get a better idea of the thing. I could tell that it had enough size to snap branches, and also that it was on 2 feet. I was carrying a large hunting knife as my only protection, and I know that wouldn't do much if it was to jump out at me. I couldn't run no matter how much I wanted to, because I knew that it would catch me. The only bet I had was to keep the same pace and keep going, ready to fight or run. I walked the almost entire way back like this. I couldn't tell anyone because who would believe this? I barely slept that entire night, expecting to hear it come closer, to see it. I have only told this story to a couple of friends of mine, and they know that I couldn't even begin to make up a story like this. To this day, I want to go back there, yet at the same time, I never want to return. This is all I have to share, and it concludes my odd, creepy experience. This all started happening years ago, before my grandma died. I am pagan. I believe in the Norse gods, particularly Fenrir and Fenris, the Norse gods of wolves. I am very in tune with animals, the earth, and the spiritual plane. I was about 13 or 14 when my grandmother started getting really sick. She would stay in her bedroom in the dark, curtains drawn and lights off. There were times where I would smell rotting flesh or rotten eggs in her room. A lot of the time there I felt cold, like something was watching me. My grandmother had been sick for years, but had quickly gotten worse in a very short period of time. At the same time, the darkness that I felt in her room got stronger and worse. Eventually, I think about 6 months after I first felt it, it was in the whole house, and it was very oppressive. Although my grandparents lived in a very hot area in northern Arizona, their house was always freezing. I would go into my grandma's room and know that this thing, which I now know is a demon, was watching me, growling at me, even attempting to scratch me. My grandma, who I was extremely close to, no longer recognized me. Her face was gaunt and different. Her eyes were huge and blank, and her hair was stringy. She looked like a skeleton with skin. There were several times where I would go visit and walk into Grandma's room and hear her chanting quietly. Eventually, her chanting got louder and she became irate. She was in an almost constant rage. She would sit and chant, "Rattle, rattle, come to me, rattle, rattle, set me free." She would talk to this rattle, and it would talk through her, and it, in turn, would say horrible things to me. This demon, I believe, killed my grandma. She died at 53. There was something truly evil in her, possessing her, and it ruined her life. It also drove my grandpa into an alcoholic depression. He passed away not too long ago. I could barely recognize him or my grandma when they passed. Ever since, there's been this dark presence just waiting to come into my life. I see it out of the corner of my eyes every now and then, just lurking, stalking, just waiting for me to screw up and lower my guard. I hope no one else has to experience losing a loved one to an evil entity. It is truly the most horrific and terrifying thing one could ever experience. I know now that my great-grandma died the same way, and believe that there is somehow a curse on my mother's side of the family, as my mother is now going down that very same path to her fate. I can only hope that I do not follow, and neither do my daughters. I have spent hours, days, and probably weeks trying to find anything on a demon that goes by rattle or anything like that. Even just a demon has a voice like a rattle or something. I've come up with nothing. I'm desperate to know what this demon is, because one day it might come for me. This story happened when I was about 8 years old, and I even confirmed it with my mother recently. A long time ago, my grandfather built a wooden cabin deep into the woods so my family could spend some time with nature. There was no electricity, no running water, not even toilets. Since the only thing to do was to play outside, I explored the area a lot. The only rule was that if I didn't see the cabin through the trees anymore, I have to come back. When this happened, I was pretty experienced in navigating myself through the forest, so I dared to break the rule, and this time go as far as I was comfortable with. I told myself that if I was going to do this, I'd walk in a straight line to be sure to not get lost, even when I don't see the cabin anymore. So I started my little exploration, and sure enough, after a couple of minutes, I couldn't see the cabin through the trees. So I continued forward. Some time passed and I noticed something in the distance. A wooden fence. At that time, I was already pretty sure no one lived in that direction, and even less so close to our cabin, so I went to check it out. Suddenly, I heard a dog bark repeatedly. When I reached the fence, there were some little holes in them, as most wooden fences do, and I looked through. I could see a dark, short-haired dog barking at me and a small house. It was nothing impressive. It really was just a regular small house with one floor and maybe an earth basement, but I couldn't really tell. My first reaction was to tell myself that someone built a house on our land illegally and thought they wouldn't get caught. So I ran back home like if the house was going to disappear, and I found my mother on the front yard. I sprinted towards her and I told her everything, and obviously she said there was no way someone could have built a house there without us knowing. And she thought I was joking or something. But I insisted so much that she decided to ask my brother to follow me so I could show him this house. And my previous fear became real. The house had completely vanished. I searched for the wooden fence again. It couldn't have been that far since I had gone in a straight line. But nothing. My brother just got bored and told me we were going back. I told my mom we didn't find anything, and the experience stopped there. But a couple of years later, I was talking to my father about the land, and he told me we weren't the first to own it, as there were 2 other people living here a long time ago. They were in little houses, and there were 1 or 2 old farms, but nothing was left of them except ruins. I visited these ruins and realized at the time that it was what I saw. It was one of those small homes that was here, standing here, a long time ago. During my second year of high school, my 5 friends and I got really interested in airsoft. A few days before a major airsoft event, we would play against each other on an abandoned fairground. The first time we went, we explored a few abandoned buildings. One of them was a swimming center that had a large basement. We decided to stay away from that basement after we saw graffiti of pentagrams and mutilated animal corpses and black burnt-out candles. The experience really scared us and grossed us out, but we still decided to play above ground. One day, we decided to go after school just before it got dark. We went home quickly, packed snacks, our guns, and our BBs, and put on our airsoft vests to say the least. We looked like special ops soldiers. We met up at the right side of the fairgrounds, which was well hidden so no one could see us enter. There was a hole in the fence, which allowed us to crawl through. After crawling through, one of my friends wanted to play a few games of free-for-all in the swimming center, even though most of us felt uneasy about the place. Finally, we all just said screw it and decided to play it cool, so none of us would think of each other as wimps. During the first match, we heard yelling and screaming, but the screaming we heard was almost animal-like, and it sounded like it was in a lot of pain. Scared and some of us pissed off, we started to shout back at the blacked-out stairwell that led to the basement. "What the hell are you doing down there?" one of my friends yelled. Then the screaming stopped, and now I could hear muffled crying, almost as if someone was screaming, but had their mouths shut. It went quiet, and a male voice came from the basement saying, "Come down and we will show you." I could see my friend's face turn pale. He was speechless as we booked it out of there, and we heard footsteps after us from behind. As we were running, we had run down the wrong pathway, and out of desperation we ran up a stairwell that led us to a ladder. We climbed up and found ourselves on the roof of the swimming center. We blocked the ladder's entrance with pieces of debris left on the roof. We waited and watched in horror as 3 tall and skinny men walked out, all in hooded jackets. One had with him a white plastic bag. One of my friends said that they shouldn't have messed with us like that, and said screw them, under his breath. My friend shouted for us to shoot at the sketchy men. The man with the white bag had dropped the bag, and a bunch of blood spilled out. It looked like a bunch of mashed up meat was inside of it. Before I knew it, we all started to unload our clips at the men, and they started to run away. And so did we. We found a fire exit ladder, climbed down, and left in a hurry. We were stupid kids back then, but at least we were smart enough to never go back. Even to this day, it still sickens me to think of what they possibly were doing in that basement. My house is relatively new. I never experienced anything paranormal or out of the ordinary in general, so this was a very new and very weird experience for me. So one night, I was laying in bed. It was around 1:30 in the morning, and I was watching Netflix, and I heard something in the kitchen fall. I thought it must have been my dog, so I continued watching my phone. After about 10 seconds, I heard a voice in my left ear telling me that it wasn't my dog. At that moment, I freaked out, and I looked around my room. There was nothing there. I calmed down a little bit and continued watching my phone. About a half an hour later, I heard something outside my door fall. Needless to say, I freaked out even more. I thought maybe it was my brother, but then I remembered he was having a sleepover with his friends, so it couldn't be him. I felt the need to go check what it was. The way my house is laid out, you come up the stairs, and on the right is my mom's room. And when you walk left of the stairs, there is a bathroom and a closet. And my room and my brother's room are right next to the bathroom, and then the family room. So when you walk out of my room and you look to the right, you can see the dark end of the family room. So, when I went out to check, I looked and saw my brother's tablet had fallen off the ledge. Once I took that into account, I looked to the right of me, into the darkened family room, and I saw a very dark, black figure with beady red eyes. At that moment, I knew I had made a mistake by coming out of my room. I then walked back into my room and waited until morning. Once morning came, I went out of my room to eat breakfast, and I noticed the black figure in the kitchen next to a broken ceramic bowl on the floor, which is probably what had broke the previous night. Slowly, I went back upstairs for another hour or two, and then went back down again and ate, and I never saw the black figure after that. A few weeks passed by, and I started to notice there were noises coming from downstairs every night at 3. I would just ignore it and pretend I didn't hear it. All of this came to a sudden stop when my birthday came around. I still don't know if the dark figure is still in my house or not, but I haven't heard any more noises coming from downstairs, and I hope I never will. And I definitely hope never to see that figure again. I've seen quite a few things that I have a hard time explaining. In case I submit any others, I'll just give you some background information for now. My father served in the military. He was descended from a Native American tribe from up north, was a survivalist, and a complete sociopath. He would often force his sons into intense survival scenarios and then left us for weeks on end to see if we'd survive. I've seen some truly disturbing things during these camping trips and some things in less stressful settings. Anyway, I'll get on with this sighting. I was 11. I had just moved back to America less than a week before. My family had decided to take a short road trip up to Maine to visit some family when we went off course. Being 11 and naive enough to think I would actually make it to Maine before my father did anything stupid, I didn't pay attention to when he pulled off onto a back road. To this day, I do not know where I was dropped off at, just that it was in a dense, forested area. I think it was in New York, but I can't say for certain. Before I knew it, I was kicked out of the car, handed my canteen, a bow, a compass, a quiver, and a knife. I was told that they'd be back after visiting family, and I'd have 15 days out there. I did the basic survival things. I found drinkable water. I built shelter, plotted out a rough map of the area in my head. All of those sort of things that I had learned growing up. It was my third or fourth night there when I heard what sounded like a woman screaming. Since mountain lions didn't come out this far east, and bears were easy to scare away if it was one, I figured that I'd go investigate, in case it was an injured hiker or something. After following the sound, all I could find was a squirrel that was partially eaten. Since the screaming had stopped, I figured that someone had come across the nasty sight while they were hiking, and ran off or calmed down and went back to hiking. So I went back to my shelter and settled in for the night. After that, though, the screaming became a nightly occurrence, and after the third night of not finding anything aside from the evidence of a predator in the area, I decided to play it safe and stay in my shelter at night. 2 days before my family would be back, where I was dropped off at, I woke up in the middle of the night to screaming right outside my shelter. I jumped out, terrified, bow in one hand, my knife and an arrow in the other. What I saw terrified me. It had to have been about the size of a dog, but shaped more like a deer. It had a very humanoid face, though, and was covered in dull, black scales. I panicked, and I shot the thing in the chest. It began hissing and wheezing as it ran off into the trees. I had thought about following it and killing it, but when I looked at its tracks, I saw something that convinced me otherwise. The creature's hind legs left behind the tracks of a small deer. The front legs, however, left the tracks you'd see from a person walking on their hands like a gorilla. Only the fingers ended with sharp claw marks scratching up the earth while it moved. I didn't sleep at all the rest of that night, and on the following morning, I dug several holes around my camp and filled them with sharpened sticks and stakes, and I covered them. I also did some squirrel hunting and harvested berries as fast as I could once my defenses were up, so that I wouldn't need to worry about losing my strength if that thing came back. It didn't that night. Not that I got any sleep anyway. In the morning, I just carved a simple warning into the trees around my camp that just said, "Danger, traps," and I left. I didn't let go of my bow until after I was picked up, and we had been driving for over an hour. I honestly don't know what I saw, or if the light had been playing tricks on me, but I know that I did hear something screaming that night, and I know what I saw in the tracks of that creature. I just know that I heard something screaming, and that I know I saw those devilish tracks.
My family lived in Texas for 7 years when they decided to move up to the Pacific Northwest of Washington State, where we still live, and where my story begins. My bedroom is on the second floor. My dad has commented that I have the nicest bedroom in our community, and it is. Now, I always sleep with my bedroom door closed, so no one would disturb me while I slept, and that included our 2 cats and a dog. For a couple of times within the first few months, I would feel pressure on the side of my bed, as if something had just sat down. And I would put my hand on the spot where I felt it, but there was nothing there. I also didn't see a thing. I believe I am one of those people who would never see an actual ghost, but things did start to change. One of our cats, a short-haired brown tabby named Rosie, loved sleeping on my bed during the daylight hours. I would always find her curled up on my bed. In June, before I graduated high school, Rosie was attacked by dogs and disappeared. We never did find her alive or dead. Since then, I often would feel something up against my legs while I slept. During one of these times, I heard purring, and I knew that it was my beloved cat, Rosie, sleeping on my bed like she used to. Then, suddenly, I stopped feeling it, which caused something to change. I would continue to feel something against my legs and also on my back, as if something was sleeping next to me, and I would feel something weird going up my back, as if something was in the room. Something was trying to harass me, but couldn't. But that wasn't all that was happening. We have a small little deck on the second floor, and I have a door that went out to that with a window right next to it, which would leave plenty of light from the moon to shine in. Several times during the night, I have seen a dark shadow blocking out the light. I can never really tell where it was standing because it was so large and massive, and I still see it to this day. I don't know what it is, but so far it hasn't become physical. That is my only worry, but I can deal with it because I can only see it at night. This was a few years ago. I was sitting in my room and my son was in the room across from mine. Our rooms were upstairs in what was essentially the attic when my grandma was alive, and we lived with my parents at the time. My parents had left for the day. I was watching TV and my son was playing his 360. All was quiet considering I was always hearing things in that house. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. I thought it was a shadow of a car going by. I looked anyway and there it was. I saw a shadow of a man, but it was larger than a human, and it was facing towards me. I sat there watching calmly for what seemed like 30 minutes, but it was just shy of a minute. It put its head down, turned, and walked away towards my son's room. I shrugged it off as maybe a shadow of my neighbor across the street. A few minutes later, I saw it again. This time I leaned forwards and looked out of the window. There's nothing. No neighbor walking by, nobody on the street, no cars, just nothing. I called my son over to my room. He walked in and the first thing I noticed was the shadow was bigger than he was. This shadow was so big you couldn't see his shadow at all. Now my son was 18 at the time. He said, like any normal teen would say with the same attitude, "What do you want?" I just looked at him and turned to the shadow and pointed. He said, "It's just your shadow." "No," I replied. "If it was mine, it would be facing the other way, not towards me. Besides, I'm not in the light." That was when he realized it wasn't me, and he looked again. At this point, the shadow moved its mouth. I saw my son run as fast as he could towards me. He said, "Mom, it just said something." I didn't doubt it. A few years back, I was sitting with my Wiccan friend, and she told me that I had demons following me, who wanted me. Dew was the only one who had told me this. I am Wiccan myself, and have always seen things all my life, so this didn't bother me as much as it would a normal person. I have heard demons in this house a lot of times and seen them. I can go as far as to say I've felt them too. I have also heard my grandfather call me and seen him there, even though he has passed. That day, I went over the house clearing it of any foul spirits, and I haven't seen this demon or any others since. It was an average humid spring night in Texas. I was spending spring break at my aunt's house, playing video games with my cousins, sharing skateboarding stories, etc. I didn't go to sleep until around midnight. By then, the entire house was asleep, and I was restlessly tossing and turning in an attempt to find a way to get comfortable in the heavy Texas air. Once I was finally asleep, I awoke, or rather dreamed I was awake, to the sound of heavy rainfall and thunder hitting against the large window and crashing outside. I was laying face up when suddenly I had a strange feeling I was being watched. I looked around the room and in the darkness, I was able to make out an outline of a small childlike figure perched on the shelf a distance from the bed. As my eyes adjusted more, I could make out more horrifying details that made my blood run cold. It was extremely thin, body and limbs and all. Its head was oval-shaped with black skin and nails, which had to have been at least a foot long each, and it had piercing white eyes. My heart froze as I locked eyes with that thing for what seemed like forever. Then this thing started hissing, the type of hiss a cat would make when it was threatened by another animal. It started to inch closer and closer to me, all while hissing still. I could feel my heart racing. I wanted to scream for someone, but nothing came out. I tried to leap out of bed and lunge at this thing, or at least make a break for the doorway. But all of my effort to get out of the bed didn't yield any result. It only exhausted me. It was as though I was paralyzed. This demon, this nightmare, was literally crawling on the bed at this point, its hissing drawing louder and louder as it drew closer. I couldn't do anything about it, but I tried to pray to God that it would go away. Somehow I passed out, and I finally woke up the next morning with tears in my eyes and an overwhelming confusion in my heart. Just what the hell had I seen, and why? I had heard of sleep paralysis before, but never imagined I'd experience it ever in my life. I did not talk about my night's ordeal with anyone, and I have not had another experience of sleep paralysis since then, and I pray to God that thing stays away. My gran used to tell me a story of the White Lady. She is a ghostly apparition that appears in the dead of night around the country roads near my gran's house. Some people have encountered her and say she is truly terrifying. She's a huge white spirit that haunts the nearby roads, frightening anyone who happens to be driving in that location at night. The most terrifying description of the White Lady is her face. She has no features at all, no nose, no mouth, no eyes. Just a pale, blank face that digs into your soul. I once heard that my uncle was on his way to my gran's one night after a few hours of drinking. Apparently, he was walking down one of the roads in the dead of night when he encountered her. She appeared right behind him. Terrified and afraid, he sprinted all the way down the road to my gran's house with the White Lady close behind. After that traumatic experience, he has not been down that road ever since. One night, I stayed at my gran's. I get up for a drink of water around 2 in the morning. I quietly walk downstairs in the front room, and to my curiosity, I stupidly opened the curtain and looked out of the window. What I saw that night scarred me for the rest of my life. A pale, white, featureless face looking right in at me. Just like all the stories I heard of her, I then shut the curtain and quickly raced upstairs straight to my gran's room. I spent the rest of the night up there. That image will always stick in my mind. Truly, it was a terrifying experience, and I hope I never see her again. This is my experience with something paranormal. I am very into supernatural happenings and events and always like to read about them to get the spooked feeling. I have always been curious about what it would be like to have an experience of my own, but now I regret that. It started one night in March. It was a quiet evening and I was the last person up as usual. I was reading a book and was getting ready to go to sleep. And a quick side note, my closet door was slightly cracked open and was right across from my bed at the other side of the room. I put my book back down on the nightstand so I could read it the following night, but just as I was about to turn off my lamp, the closet door swung open with such force it made me flinch. I was terrified of what just happened. I sat there under my blankets for about 10 minutes, until I finally got the courage to get up and go to my parents' room. Luckily, I made it without anything else happening. Fast forward 3 months later, I couldn't stop thinking about that night, until yesterday when I was getting ready to go to my grandma's house to visit. My mom wanted me to go put on some deodorant because, I was in the middle of puberty and was getting ready to go into my teen stages. I walked upstairs and into the bathroom. Once I was done, I walked out at the doorway and to the staircase. But before I left, I heard a deep voice say something. It sounded like, "Run." Immediately, I looked over to where the voice had come from, and to my horror, a figure. It seemed to be 6 feet tall, and it had gray skin and deep black eyes. It was looking back at me. I was terrified, so I ran faster than I'd ever run before to escape the thing. I got in the car sweating and shaking in fear. My mom was worried that something happened. She asked me, Are you okay?" "I'm fine," I said. and off we went, still terrified by what I saw. No matter what, I will always be haunted by the look of those deep, dark eyes. I feel they will never leave me. I still currently live in that house, but I'll never go upstairs alone, ever again. I'm not a man of true faith, although I did grow up attending a Catholic church by the name of St. Andrew's, the same church this occurred in. Some backstory first. My great-grandmother was originally a white-healing witch in Mexico in her younger days. She would recount stories of demons she had battled whilst being a healer. I, being young, never really believed in the faith that my family practiced, but after the events of this story, I have never doubted that there are higher beings and evil beings. It was June 6th in 2006, a cliché as it sounds. I had been brought to St. Andrew's Catholic Church by my great-grandmother and my grandmother, as they believed this was a day when demons would be rampant through all people and places. I was only 8 at the time and had been tired of staying at the church praying literally all day. It was around 8 p.m. and the sun had set. I sighed and stopped praying. I decided to look up at one of the skylights attached to the roof. I don't know why, but I stared at the skylight for about 10 minutes when I noticed a long, black figure as it slowly crawled across the exposed, stained glass. I can still vividly remember the shadowy mass shape as it slithered across the 12-foot-long glass. It had 2 long arms with sharp points at the end, 2 huge wings that easily blotted out the sky behind it, 2 long, thin legs, and a tail that swished even after its body had left the window. I, to this day, won't go back to that church, and I now have a firm belief that something is beyond this life, something that is truly evil.